It was mentioned at your lunch, in a fascinating speech by Jean-Philippe Cotis, that the average figure for the average guy, in other words, per capita GDP, has become a kind of de facto well-being index. How true and how sad. So it's interesting that an example that we have here for you is exactly about that. It's about my country, that's India, and a project that an NGO that I'm closely associated with called GIST has worked on, where we looked at the externalities. We worked out what are the value of ecosystem services delivered, and the answer was 7.3% of GDP. So to that extent, classical GDP is understated by 7%. And then we thought for a moment, just wait. Let's ask a different question. Let us ask, to whom do these benefits flow? When you ask that question, to whom do the benefits flow, then we are talking about, well, who benefits from the flow of water and nutrients from the forests to the aquifers to the fields? Who benefits from the gathering of non-timber forest products from the forests? Who benefits from all this? Not you and I. We just go and buy our shopping from the market at slightly higher prices if the forests disappear. But who really benefits is the poor farmer, the subsistence farmer, the ones involved in animal husbandry on the ground, the coastal fisherfolk who have no option except that, and the people who are dependent on gathering from the forests. So those are classically the poor. So what we say is that instead of just looking at GDP as the reference point here, find out how much is ecosystem services as a fraction of the GDP of the poor. And when you do that, the answer is staggeringly different, because it's not 7% anymore. It is more like 57% of the GDP of the poor. And that's what I mean about, I truly took home the message at lunch today, and here you have it as an example. We also, in the TEEB project, had talked about the linkage between the Millennium Development Goals and ecosystem degradation. And here I'm talking about not the MDG 7, as it is sometimes referred to, which is about environment, but rather all of the other MDGs. So we're talking about, in this example here of Haiti, which is on the left of that river course that you see versus the right, where deforestation has lost something like 97% of its forest cover, where floods and droughts follow cyclically, where it is not even possible for the investment in the Avezac reservoir to be productive, where agricultural land has lost half its area over the last 40 years, and where clearly the MDGs of eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, or for that matter, reducing, creating an MDG 8 opportunity for agricultural involvement in global partnership and development, or improving maternal health, MDG 5, or even MDG 4. That's probably the worst one of that. MDG 4 is about child mortality, and it's a sad truth that because of the quality of water that children drink, 90% of them are permanently infected with intestinal diseases, simply because it is not filtered through any natural process. It's usually stagnant. And that's really an example of how all of the MDGs are in one way or the other connected with and are dependent upon our neglect of ecosystems and biodiversity, in this case, our neglect of forest conservation. Another aspect of the study was, and this is both a negative and a positive aspect, was the sheer size of natural capital being lost because of business as usual. We did this in two ways. We worked out the future impact in this study of forest losses in terms of the ecosystem services lost and the human welfare cost of that. Therefore, what is that as a percentage of GDP? That was one calculation. The other calculation was, all right, well, you've lost the forest, you've lost the ability to provide that ecosystem service forever. What's the present value lost? And that's natural capital. When we worked that out, that natural capital loss, based on a different range of discounting assumptions, was between 1.5 and 3.5 trillion euros, or that's million dollars. So we're talking about a size of capital that's of the order of magnitude of the financial markets capital lost in the biggest financial markets, financial industry meltdown that has taken place. And we're therefore talking about a size of natural capital loss every year for the last 20 odd years, which is comparable to the biggest loss that we have seen in the financial industry in its history. The more positive aspect of that is that if, and just for a moment, if that triangle that we see out there, which represents the loss, what if we didn't do business as usual? What if, instead of allowing rivers to be polluted and forests to be lost, we instituted methods of recreating forests, of cleaning rivers, and of effectively rebuilding that natural capital, which is represented by that same triangle of loss, which is in fact a triangle of opportunity? What if? And that's one of the keys that I will bring upon in a few moments, where we talk about the recreation of natural capital as something that is a positive act of recreating public goods and services. And once again, Kevin Conrad and many others this morning talked about the need to refocus our thinking on what is it that governments are supposed to do. I think a large element of that must be the preservation of public wealth. It cannot just be, even though I am and you are from corporate worlds, it cannot just be ensuring that we retain perpetually good profitability, because at the end of the day, we are private sector. We will look after our bottom lines. We have to. That's our job. The Green Economy Report, which is the main point that I want to bring in here, is actually quite a large project in terms of its objectives, the sectors that it looks at, and the enabling conditions that it needs to address, and also the showcases, because we are bringing out a few best-of-breed examples from various countries, all the way from Korea to the US to Africa to Latin America. The sectors are fairly well recognizable. We're talking about whatever you normally look at: sustainable cities, waste management, clean technology, sustainable transportation, agriculture, and finally ecological infrastructure, which is really about thinking of forests and water bodies and wetlands as utilities, because just as electricity companies provide electricity, well, these also provide water and climate protection and climate mitigation. Ideally, in a world without subsidies and with a totally flat playing field, you would not need anything to allow a green economy to evolve, because by its nature, this is an economy which leverages an additional capital, nature, and its productivity. And ideally, there would be no need for a discussion such as this, but the reality is that the enabling conditions have to be met. So we do have significant subsidies which tilt the football field. Fossil fuel subsidies, both production and price subsidies, account to something like, by a study, something like $240 to $300 billion per annum. Agricultural subsidies, approximately $275 billion. Many of them are directed towards fertilizers and pesticides. So we do have a many-layered subsidy structure globally and down to domestic economies, which does inhibit the creation of a green economy, hence the need to look at enabling conditions. Finance, last and not the least, is, of course, also entry barriers, because getting consumers to change behaviors, and there we have touched once again the same points that were brought up by many people again. Consumers, businesses, and governments all are involved in this whole process of greening the economy. Ecological infrastructure is not that familiar to many people, but I'll give an example from the developed world, and this is San Francisco. This is one of the 2 reservoirs which feed the city with water, and they are managed pretty much as public utilities by the San Francisco Public Utility Commission. In fact, that is the manager of these utilities. So it does happen. You would have heard of the equivalent case in the Catskills for New York, and so on. And it can happen and should happen in many other places.